One of the holy grails for home distilling and I guess distilling in general is the idea of being able to force age a product. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about what that actually means to me. And I've had some ideas that I've been thinking about and playing with over the last year and a half, 2 years. Today, I want to do a little bit more of a formal experiment to see if those ideas that I have, well, if they do anything. How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse, and this is Still It, the channel all about chasing the craft of home distillation and making it a legitimate hobby. This video is going to focus on a little test I've set up to see if something I've been playing with for a long time actually does any good. And here's the problem, guys. When you think about aging a spirit, you kind of have to think about two parts of aging. One is literally just getting the oak flavor into the spirit. Oak teabagging, I like to think of it as. You're taking the stuff in the oak that has a flavor component and a color component to it, and you're dragging it out into the spirit so that it changes the appearance and the flavor of the spirit. That's pretty simple. There's not a lot of secrets about how to do that faster. A larger volume of oak, and depending on the way you're aging and the exact sort of form factor the oak comes in, a larger surface area can help as well. That I don't think is controversial. That is not something that people are worrying about. That's a relatively solved problem. The part of aging that is a little bit trickier is kind of the magic component, the age component. It's not magic, don't get me wrong, it's chemistry, but being able to track exactly the chemical changes that are happening in whiskey or any other aged spirit like rum, for example, is tricky. It's not a simple problem to solve, and figuring out ways to make exactly those same chemical reactions happen faster, that's even more complex. Some commercial spirits are aged a whole lot faster than others. A lot of stuff in Texas, for example, is going to be 2-3 years maximum, as opposed to something in Scotland, which will be, 5 to 20 years perhaps. But even the 2 years is a long time for someone sitting in a shed making their own product. You make something, you want to drink it, you got to wait for 2 years. That's a long ass time. This whole topic is super, super interesting to me. And in the future, there's going to be some more out there ideas we're going to play with. I've got a podcast coming up that's going to be great fun, and a video that's going to support that to try those ideas out. But in this video, I want to talk about the idea of preloading a spirit. No, I am not talking about drinking a shitload of booze before you head out to the bar so you can be a cheap drunk. I'm talking about the idea of cramming as much of the wood stuff into the spirit at the beginning of the aging process rather than letting it happen over a period of time. I know that I'm not the first person to do this. I don't know if anyone else has tried this test exactly, and I don't know if anyone else has another name for it. So if you know of those things, comment section, help a guy out, that'd be awesome. Before I tell you the idea, I just want to say that this is something that I'm doing purely because I did it kind of by mistake a couple of times, and it worked out really well, and the fuzzy logic in my brain kind of makes sense. That doesn't mean you should take it as gospel, and I haven't actually tasted the samples at this point in time, so I can't even say whether they back it up. However, the idea is that the chemical changes that happen in the spirit can only happen if the spirit and the wood are interacting with each other. My thinking is the further the spirit penetrates the wood for longer, and the longer that bits of the wood are in suspension or in solution in the alcohol, the more chance those chemical reactions have of happening. The problem with the oak teabagging versus aging is that if you try and cram too much wood into it for too long, you get too much wood extraction and not enough age. It's going to go bitter, spicy, tannic, all of those horrible things before it has time for those chemical reactions to actually take place. So the idea with preloading is we get a buttload of stuff out of the wood nice and early, almost to the point that we've over-oaked it, and then we dial the amount of oak interaction way back and kind of just let things mellow and age on a slower process from there on in, hoping that we've given it a jump start by getting a lot of stuff out of the wood and into the spirit early on so it has more time to go through those chemical reactions. In the past, I've just kind of played with doing this in two different ways. Today, I want to try and actually set up a little completely flawed but interesting experiment to see if they actually do anything. Like I said in the intro, this is something I've been wanting to set up a little test on for a long time, but I've never got around to doing it. I happened to mention that to Still Spirits, and they were instantly on board with sponsoring this video. They sent over a couple of their new artisan kits to be used as test subjects, I guess? Here's the thing, guys. These kits are not for people that are making all grain recipes all the time. It just doesn't make sense. What does make sense is if you're the sort of person that just wants the convenience of being able to go to the homebrew store and pick everything up in one box. Or you're the sort of distiller that is new to the craft and you've been messing around with, sugar washes and essences, and you are looking to take the next step. The whiskey kit uses a similar concept to the safety net video series we've got going on now, taking a malted barley base, adding extra specialty malts to it to make up for the flavor tax we're being charged for the convenience factor of using table sugar. The gin kits, on the other hand, come with everything you need to make a neutral spirit. And guys, no turbo yeast in these. And they also come with all the botanicals you need to turn that neutral into gin. I've made both kits now, and the gin turned out great, but for this video, we're going to be using the whiskey as the base for all of these tests. For the purposes of this video, I'm assuming that the specific way the whiskey was made doesn't impact the results. We're not looking at how delicious or exactly what the final products taste like. We're going to be looking at how they taste in relation to each other. But for those of you that want to scrutinize this process a little bit more in depth, I'm totally cool with that. I'm going to give you a rundown on exactly how the base whiskey was made and how all these samples were put together. I pretty much made the whiskey as per the Still Spirits instructions. The LME was dissolved in hot water along with the sugar, and then that was diluted down to 25 litres and 25 degrees Celsius, which gave me a starting gravity of 1.070. Nutrients were added and everything was agitated thoroughly before pitching the Distillers Series whiskey yeast. Everything was fermented in a closed system under an airlock at 25 degrees Celsius. Once fermentation was finished, the product was siphoned out of the fermenter into the still for a stripping run, followed by a spirit run. Both runs were done on the T500 with the alembic dome top. Aggressive cuts were made by taste, and the resulting spirit was proofed down to 57% ABV. Now here's the thing, guys, everything in this video, all of the samples were made from this exact same batch of whiskey. 3 of the samples were made with the Kentucky bourbon barrel chips that came in the kit, but because I'm doing something kind of weird, I needed extra chips, and I substituted these with some other chips that were pretty similar. They're not the same, but I think for the purpose of this test, it doesn't matter. The other 3 samples are made with Kentucky barrel staves. Obviously, they're not going to be the same barrels or even from the same distillery. To be honest, these 2 tests aren't to compare this versus this. They're kind of, think of them like 2 parallel tests running next to each other, not testing against each other. The first 2 jars, so one from the chip side and one from the stave side, are very simple. A set amount of whiskey goes into the jar along with 11 grams, specifically 11 grams. I actually sat there and shaved the stave down to get very close to 11 grams. Went into each. These got sealed up, they got put on the shelf and forgotten about for 1 month. The second samples of each. These got exactly the same treatment. Same amount of whiskey, same amount of wood, but they went through 6 hot-cold cycles. Now, I'm not going to show you the exact way I actually did the hot cycles because, to be fair, it was kind of sketchy. I did it on the stovetop. I am very, very, very used to using my stove. I know exactly how it operates. I'm lucky enough to work from home within line of sight of the stove, so I could see them the whole time. I felt comfortable doing it myself. It's not something that I would condone or recommend other people doing. I don't want that on my conscience. I feel kind of sneaky not showing you, but you get the idea. I need to get a bain-marie or a sous vide system so I can do this stuff a whole lot easier. It held the samples within 4 degrees of 55 degrees Celsius, which was the target hot temperature, for 5 hours each cycle. Both samples were then put into the freezer overnight to be run again the next day. So 6 full cycles, then the jars were put on the same shelf as the others and forgotten about for the rest of the month. The last 2 samples, 1 chips and 1 staves, again, these 2 were treated slightly different. The same amount of whiskey, but this time 3 times the amount of oak. So 33 grams of oak chips in this one, 33 grams of staves in this one, and I left them like that, undisturbed, on the same shelf as the other samples for 1 week. At 1 week, I took 2/3 of the wood out of each and sealed the jars back up, put them back on the shelf, and forgot about them for the next 3 weeks. So in other words, all 6 jars aged for 1 month. It was just the beginning week that was a little bit different for each of them. None of the jars were opened at all during the aging process. I wanted to keep everything as similar as I could, with the exception, obviously, of the jars that had wood taken out of them 1 week in. Because of this, an hour ago, I decided to open all 6 jars up and let them breathe for 10 minutes, and then close them all back up again, and now they're ready to actually be tasted. Let's start with the Staves, because, as you can probably see already, the color is quite different. I'm going to attribute some of that to surface area difference between Staves and chips, but also have a look at the actual colors of each of these. It's not just an amount of oak thing, it's actually a different color. And looking back at the chips now, there is more redwood in the chips than the Staves. So I think that accounts for a little bit. Anyway, my point is I'm going to do these first because I think tasting this first is less likely to affect my palate, tasting that second. So let me get this poured up. Let me have a sample of everything and I'll talk through what I'm finding. The first thing to note is probably the difference between them in color. And to be fair, the first two, so the one that is just 11 grams over a month and the one that was the hot cold, are very similar in color, which is interesting to me. I feel really bad for not taking images or video of all of these things at different stages throughout the entire process. The color on the hot cold one was way darker than this one, and it's caught up over time. The overloaded wood one is, however, significantly darker. I'm sorry guys, it's probably going to be slightly hard for me to actually show that on camera. I'll do my best with a piece of white paper for you. Let's get stuck into the first one, which is the one that just had 11 grams of oak, 11 grams of oak stave, I should say, for 1 month. The first thing that hits me is that it smells very, very similar to the wash and the initial spirit after I'd made the cuts. I've actually got some white that I saved here as well, in case we want to do some further experimenting. Let me know what you want to see. And yeah, it smells very, very similar. It has a backbone of malt, but then it has a interesting, almost like, it's like crystal malt to me, but a little bit darker, a little bit warmer. It's like a warm caramel sauce that you'd put over a dessert, or maybe not quite a fudge sauce, but yeah, somewhere in there, like a warm, hot caramel sauce, I guess. That's the specialty grains coming through, I'm sure. Green grass and green apple, not the green apple that's delicious in Irish whiskies, the green apple that just is new whiskey, I guess. That's not great, but I'm not surprised that is in this. A lot of whiskies I have at this age, if I'm aging them in a standard way, have that characteristic. It's pretty similar. The same flavors came through. Honestly, it's on the nose and on the palate, it's quite one-dimensional. It's just those flavors straight up. There's not really anything blending them together. There's not much nuance to it. And the finish is still quite young and shiny. It's jaggy and harsh, not horribly. I mean, I made relatively conservative cuts on the tail end as well. But yeah, it doesn't taste like an old whiskey. It tastes like something that's been aging for a month to me. Let's move on to the second one. This is the one that went through the hot colds. And straight away, you can notice that warm caramel note has been dialed way down. And it's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. The grain is still there. The grain has changed slightly. It's more dusty and varied in its flavor. There's different kinds of grain flavors that are all fighting to come out. I think part of that is that green grass and green apple have gotten out of the way. So they've let the more earthy notes of the grain rise up. The really interesting thing though is the amount of complex fresh fruit that's been crammed on top of it all. It makes it all more vibrant. It lifts it up, it makes it feel fresh, but more leaning towards the orchardy grapes and pears and stuff like that. That's quite interesting. Right, palate. Same thing. It's more vibrant. It's been lifted. The mouth feels changed. It's not, I wouldn't say, I guess it is slightly more acidic. It's lifted. It's light. It doesn't feel thin because of that though, which is weird. It doesn't feel so heavy on the palate. It's a lifted lightness, a complexity with those fresh fruit flavors mixed in with the graininess that once again hasn't gone all the way through to like grain funk, but it's much more dusty and earthy than it is in this. There's a wood presence there, similar to this. It's very much a Scotch wood profile. It's not bourbon. It is buttery, slight amount of vanilla. and just a little bit of sweetness kind of holding everything together now in this one. All right, going on to number 3. The warm caramel's still there, but it's much less one-dimensional now, and it no longer reminds me of beer at all. There's also a interesting, like, darker fruit thing going on. A hint of dates and figs and stuff, but more plums, actually. It reminds me of a fruit pie. The lightest fruit is kind of apricot, and the darkest fruit's plum, but it sort of sits somewhere in between. Fruit pie with cream on it. That's what it reminds me of. The grain is there, but less pronounced than this. The biggest thing is that there is more kind of overt wood presence. We're starting to get a little bit of pepper, a little bit of tannin, and a whole lot more kind of wood sweetness. And it finishes much, much rounder and smoother than each of them. And that feels more like it's coming from the addition of more woody sweetness, I guess you'd call it. All right, team, we've got the same situation here. I've been tasting these for a little while now, getting to know them. I've got notes. Let's get stuck in. The first thing to note on all of these is that they are a very, very, very different beast than the ones we did with the Staves. There was a lot more red wood, a lot more toasted, not charred wood in those chips. I do not think this is a difference between chips and Stave. I could be wrong. That's my take on it. Very, very different wood profiles. It's not just the amount that it's interacting with. Anyway, so here we go. So on the one that was basically the control, had 11 grams of wood chips for 1 month. Dusty oak, heading very much towards bourbon oak territory rather than Scotch, which is what we were getting over here. So yeah, dusty oak and a hint of that kind of old antique. I don't know what it is. It's what antique furniture smells like to me. I don't know if it's the wood itself. I don't know whether it is I think it's the oil maybe that's rubbed on it. I don't know. It smells like old handcrafted, like real furniture. There's not a whole lot of the spirit itself left there. I'm getting hints of the grain and hints of that warm caramel, but it is way down below the oak characteristics on this. Flavor-wise, pretty much the same thing. There is actually a little bit of astringency and pepper. That caramelly thing shows up even less than I would expect. The grain is there, and it's sort of humming along in the middle. It wants to taste like a bourbon, but it's grain, not corn. It's quite interesting. It tastes... there's something very familiar to it. I can't put my finger on it. The finish is kind of jaggy, though. It's got an astringency, it's got a pepperness, and that combines with that sort of new whiskey feeling in your mouth. All right, number 2, the one that's had the hot colds. Same amount of oak, but hot colds. The oak's still there. There's less of the antique furniture note on it. That antique furniture thing is very much just a straight up flavor that comes from charred American oak. For me, that's what I relate it to. It tastes like the oak smells after you've charred it. So if you char it and then either spray it down or spritz it or just let it go, wait until the smoke is dissipated and it's no longer a smoky flavor. It's that smell that's left in the air afterwards. It's a really intriguing smell, but it's very much like just straight oak. Anyway, that's dialed down and there's a very interesting sweetness on the nose. It's vanilla, but it's also kind of berry-ish. It's lighter, it's more fresh. It's playing with that fudgy flavor, which is buried quite down deep on this one, but it's still there. Almost like blackberry chocolate. Blueberries and blackberries with cream over the top. It's delicious. It's really cool. It's a nice finish. I like it. And there's a lingering vanilla to it as well. Interestingly enough, it is less bitter and less tannic than this. Very, very interesting. Maybe it's the same amount of bitter and tannic, but there's more sweet things on top of it to cover up. This one has more of that straight charred bourbon barrel flavor to me than the middle one. Dusty oak and old furniture, the same as this one, but what it's layering more of on top of that is this sort of, it's a fullness around that. So it's leather and almonds that kind of fill that void out a little bit instead of just being a straight up oak flavor like this. It's quite nice. A small hint of fruit. It's darker and less vibrant than this one. More like cherry pie, I guess. Stewed cherries, cooked cherries, not fresh fruit. Vanilla, a little bit of butterscotch, and a big bourbon barrel candy finish. The finish is rounder and fuller and thicker and sweeter than both of these. And as that fades, it lingers on quite a nice, soft astringency for quite a long time. What I thought would be fun was to get Wifey in real quick to taste through things and just to say which one she likes and why. She has no idea what we're talking about right now, but these are the 3 Stave samples. So which out of the...
Stave.
Yeah, it's true. Which is your least favorite?
I think this one.
Interesting.
Yeah, it tastes cheap.
Okay. So
cheap taste.
Here's the thing, guys. If you haven't seen us do this together before, here's the thing.
Why do you ask me?
She can taste things that I don't even know are there. And after us figuring it out for ages, I finally catch up with her. Her raw senses are amazing. However, her power of description
is terrible.
Yes.
This one tastes kind of cheap. This one's really lovely, easy to drink, smells good.
This
one smells good, doesn't taste very good.
All of that, which to be honest, I'm not going to put in. Maybe the Patreons would like to watch this and I'll stick it up for them. But for everyone else, that was a really long list of me going through shit that I've said earlier and her agreeing with me. Did you disagree with anything I said?
I modified some of it.
Okay, sure.
Watered down some of the things that you said.
Yeah.
That's about it.
All right, so we're going to do exactly the same thing with this one. Which one do you prefer here?
I changed them.
Oh, shit, I did too.
You keep blaming me for messing up the glasses.
Yeah, it's me.
I think one is thicker. I think one is the thickest. That was my pick.
That's really interesting to me.
I like them all better than the last 3, probably. I messed up your episode.
No, you haven't messed it up at all. I went through the list of everything that I tasted in it, and the things that she called bullshit were blueberries. You didn't get any blueberries.
No.
But you do get blackberries in this.
If you do the breathing thing.
Yeah. Retro nasal.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Is it a thing?
It is,
Oh.
yeah.
I thought I made it up.
Oh, and I said, actually try it again and see if you get almonds in that.
I wouldn't say almond, but walnut.
Walnut? You get walnut.
Like walnut husk.
Yeah, I can see that.
I can't get on board with the almond.
The leather you got from this, the blackberry, yes, in this, but not the blueberry.
Yeah.
And Erin just prefers this over all, which I think is because it's just a straight up more oaky product, which is fine. And you think this one's the thickest and like creamiest, stickiest, sugariest?
Yeah, sugariest. So
I'm not full of shit, just a little bit.
Just
stretching the truth slightly.
Yes.
So I will put a slightly longer version of that over on Patreon so you can see more of what happened. But I think that gives a good summary of what Erin's thoughts are. For the most, we seem to align pretty well. And some of the more niche things, like me calling blueberry in this, she disagreed. That's fine. What I want to do now, however, is talk through some of the limitations, the glaring, obvious limitations on all of this before I even begin to talk about what I think this means in terms of what's actually happening and what I think it might mean in terms of what I'm going to try doing in the future. And the biggest, most obvious glaring problem is that you're listening to some random big hairy dude in his shed with a camera. I mean, number 2, this is kind of assuming that giving that extra 3 weeks for both of these 2 versions is going to do something different than just doing the overload for a week and stopping, or just doing the hot colds and stopping and tasting it right then. In my experience, that is true. That extra bit of time after loading it up with wood in one of those 2 ways is really, really important. But I haven't actually tested it. It's also worth mentioning again, just that these 2 things shouldn't be compared to each other. So I don't think we should be comparing this to this, and this to this, and so on. And number 3, obviously the practices that I used were shocking in terms of an actual scientific experiment, but it is what it is, and this is what we've got to work with. Let's get stuck into actually pulling this apart. For me, number 1 on both sides, for the Staves and the chips, was the least interesting. And I'm going to take those off the table now. The reason I say I think it's the least interesting is because the flavors were the most like straight down the line. There was less complexity. There was less surprising stuff that kind of just happened, that it evolved from the whiskey. There were very little flavors that weren't expected, right? So it was the flavors in the raw spirit and the flavors in the oak. It was straight up like licking the oak and drinking raw spirit. So number 2, even though I switched glasses, I know I messed up when I re-poured for Wifey, but that is what it is, I promise you. This shows to me kind of what can happen from the spirit side. And what I mean by that is the development of esters in the whiskey. So the interesting things that are popping up here for me are the fruity flavors, the fresh fruit flavors. Flavors that weren't there before, flavors that didn't have any real reason to be there. Like I got blackberry and blueberry off this. Erin disagreed and said that she didn't get the blueberry, but she did get the blackberry. I mean, it's a pretty similar flavor, but you get the idea, right? We both agreed that they were fresh and vibrant and lifting flavors. I'm thinking, remember, guys, big hairy guy talking out of his ass in his shed, but I'm thinking this is esterification. Creating fruity flavors from the acids coming out of the wood and mingling with the alcohol and the spirit, and also the acids coming over from the still that are being esterified as well. Creating light, fruity, slightly more volatile but uplifting flavors. This may be due to the fact that these spirits were at a higher heat for a long time. The heat is going to help those chemical reactions happen quicker, perhaps? I don't know. That's just a wild guess, but that seems to be the effect that we got on both of these. Moving on to these two. This to me sort of shows off what happens as wood continues to do its thing a little bit. It was really, really interesting to me that I found number 1 more tannic and more spicy than number 3. That blows my mind because we tend to think of those flavors as coming from the wood, and I crammed a whole lot more wood into number 3 than number 1. So maybe it's kind of a case of getting it into the spirit, pulling those flavors out, and then those flavors have the chance to go through chemical reactions themselves and break down. But in both cases, the wood flavors that were coming on the third one, the one that had been overloaded with just extra wood to start with, it was the wood flavors to me that developed out more, the deeper, darker flavors, the richness and the creaminess from the wood. And in the chips example, the leather and the nuttiness coming out as well. Those to me are flavors that evolve from the wood. So what does all of this mean? Potentially absolutely nothing. I don't know. Like I said, this is a completely flawed experiment. I'm just messing around and telling you what I'm finding out. But I would be really, really interested to hear if you guys have done experiments like this. If you haven't, I would be really interested for you to do them and to come back to this video and drop your findings down to sort of start adding up our knowledge on this topic. Things that I would like to try in the future are doing both back to back. So putting way too much wood in and doing hot colds and then letting it sit for a long time. And I think probably if I did it again, I would take some more samples at different points along the way to compare to each other as well, to see how the flavor changes over time. That could be interesting. It could also be very interesting to perhaps switch from one to the other. So use chips, literally of the same wood. Like, so you get a wood stave, chip it up, use the chips to start with, hot cold, overload it with the amount, then take it out of the hot cold cycles and reduce the amount of wood, leaving staves in there and let it go for a month or so. That could be really interesting too. So I've literally just finished this, guys. I haven't had time to mull this over a whole lot yet. And as I do, I'm sure I'm going to come up with other ideas on things that I should test, ways that I should go about it in the future. But I'd love to hear what you guys think as well. What do you think we should test? How do you think we should use this in the future? I will tease a little bit and say that we've got a podcast and a video coming up that's going to take this potentially to a whole new level, which should be a whole lot of fun. Anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video because it's been a blast for me to make. Make sure you give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't done so already. And I'll catch you next time, guys. Keep on chasing the craft. See ya.